Well, it's getting late, isn't it? And it's time for all good wellies to cuddle up in bed. You don't want to be out after dark, do you? Foggy Jack might come for you. And then where would you be? In several places at once, wouldn't you? Would you like me to read you a bedtime story? Of course you would. Well, curl up in front of the telly, and Uncle Jack will tell you a story. Tonight's story is called Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time there lived a poor woodcutter and his wife and his two aged parents. The old man's name was Hansel, and the old woman's name was Gretel. There was little to eat, and when a hard winter came across the land, so hard that the wolves prowled the crossroads at night, the woodcutter could no longer feed his parents. He lay in bed with his wife, and they discussed what to do. The woodcutter's wife said, "Here's what we do, Liebling. We will lead them deep into the woods, yeah? To gather the firewood, okay? And then we will trick them, and we will leave them there. And natürlich, there will be enough bread for the both of us." For you see, they were not her parents, and they didn't particularly like her. Now at first the woodcutter said, "Well, I don't know, maybe I should leave you in the woods instead." But his wife said, "Oh, it's a funny man. No, they're old and they do not work anymore, okay?" And the woodcutter had to admit she had a point. What the woodcutter did not know was that his parents had overheard the entire conversation, for they had very good hearing for old people, and they'd not been sleeping well. And Hansel said to Gretel, "Our son's going to leave us in the woods to starve. What shall we do?" Gretel said, "Let us gather bright pebbles by the light of the moon." The next day at dawn, the woodcutter and his wife led his parents deep, deep into the woods, deeper than they'd ever gone to cut firewood. The wife made a fire for them and said, "Rest by the fire while we chop the wood." And soon enough they heard the sound of chopping. Hansel and Gretel thought perhaps their son had not left them after all. But late in the evening the wind died down, and so did the sound of chopping. For it was only a branch that the woodcutter had rigged to bang against a tree in the wind. But Hansel and Gretel, they dropped bright pebbles all along the path into the woods, and they were able to follow them all the way back to the woodcutter's house, which had been their house when they raised him. When they came to the door, the woodcutter's wife, well, she was alarmed to see them. "You wicked people! Your son has been crying ever since you left him. He thought you did not want to come back." That night the woodcutter told his wife, "It's a gift from God. We don't have to leave my parents in the woods after all." "Oh, you fool! Idiot!" said the woodcutter's wife. "Do we have more bread heute Abend than we did yesterday?" And the woodcutter had already agreed once to abandon his parents, so he didn't really have a leg to stand on, did he? So he agreed to lead them out into the woods the next morning. That night Hansel went to gather bright pebbles by the light of the moon, but the woodcutter's wife had locked the door, so he couldn't gather any. In the morning Hansel begged his son for a crust of bread to eat on the forest path, but he did not eat it. Instead, as his son led him deep into the woods, he broke off small bits and dropped them on the forest path. All along the way, Hansel spoke to his son of happier days, when they both had been young and the land was fat. He was hoping to soften his son's heart, and the woodcutter, well, he smiled and nodded, for when you're going to kill a man, it costs nothing to be polite. And again, the woodcutter's wife made them a fire and made them lie down and rest by it, while the woodcutter and his wife went into the forest to chop wood. But they heard no branch banging against a tree, for the time was past for pretenses. Hansel said to Gretel, "Let us find our way home before night falls, because it's very cold and they're not coming back for us." And I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. We'll have to continue this delightful story tomorrow night. Did Hansel and Gretel find their way home? And did the woodcutter welcome them back? And did they all live happily ever after? I hope not. What kind of fairy tale do you think this is? Tune in tomorrow to find out. Well, it's getting late, isn't it? And it's time for all good citizens to hop into bed for the night. Would you like me to read you a bedtime story? Of course you would. I haven't finished the story of Hansel and Gretel. Well, snuggle up by your telly or radio, and I'll tell you how it ends. When we left Hansel and Gretel, their son had just abandoned them in the woods for the second time. But Hansel and Gretel had cleverly left a trail of breadcrumbs for them to find their way back. But it was a very hard winter, and starving birds had already pecked up all of the breadcrumbs, and snow began to fall, which covered up anything the birds had left. Hansel and Gretel could not find their way home. Instead, they only wandered deeper into the woods. After 3 days of trudging in the snow without anything to eat, they were on the verge of dying of exposure when they came upon a small house. A white bird stood upon the roof in spite of the snow, and now and then pecked at it. And so they realized that the entire house was made out of gingerbread, and the windows were made out of clear sugar. They were starving, of course, so Hansel helped himself to a chunk of the eaves, while Gretel broke off some of the window frame, which was made of frosting. And then a voice came from inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse. Who's nibbling at my house?" They answered, "It's only the wind which nibbles away at all things." But then Gretel poked her finger through the window in order to break off a piece of the clear sugar, and a witch suddenly came out of the house. Now you see, they could tell she was a witch because she was beautiful and young, but she moved carefully, like someone who had once been old. Now they expected her to be angry, but she was kind, or so she seemed. "You poor dears," she said, "come into my house and sit by the fire, and you can have all the gingerbread and cake you like." And they ate gingerbread and cake and pancakes, and soon they fell asleep, for they were exhausted. But the witch was only pretending to be kind to Hansel and Gretel. Really, she intended to cook and eat them. In fact, she had made the gingerbread house in order to lure someone to eat. For witches believe, I am told, that if you eat someone, you get their power. Hansel woke up in a cell made not of sugar, but iron bars and oak beams, and cry as he might, no help came to him. And the witch woke Gretel, saying, "Get up, cook a nice meal for your husband, for he's to be fattened up." So Gretel cooked up an omelette full of cheese and pancakes and biscuits. Biscuits for breakfast? Well, it might have been wonderful if it wasn't so evil. And the witch watched Hansel eat, planning how to cook him up. But then Gretel hit her hard as she could in the head with the firewood axe, and the witch never looked at anything again. Some say Gretel did something cleverer to the witch, like tricking her into the oven. But it doesn't pay to be too clever, you know. Gretel let her husband out of his cell, and the two of them rejoiced and ate as much of the house as they could stomach. and as they munched and crunched the house, they discovered there were pearls and precious stones hidden in the gingerbread. Hansel filled his pockets, and Gretel filled her apron. By now, the sun had come out, and Hansel and Gretel were able to work out which way their home was. So they walked home, excited to tell their son all about the pearls and rubies and sapphires they'd found in the house. The woodcutter's wife answered their door. The woodcutter's wife... Here it comes. The woodcutter's wife answered the door, and, well, Gretel quickly cut her down with an axe. Good old Gretel. And her son quickly forgave her, for blood is thicker than water. And the moral of the story is, if you want someone dead, do it yourself. Well, no, that's not actually the moral of the story. This story doesn't have a moral. Good stories never do. Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. Tune in tomorrow evening, and I'll tell you the rest of the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's a lovely story, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the rest of it. For now, this is Jack Worthing saying good night all. See you in the morning.